Good evening and welcome to this online Royal Society of Edinburgh Curious event. I am Bridget McConnell. I'm the Chief Executive of Glasgow Life, the organisation that manages all the culture and sport and events for the City of Glasgow. I'm also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and I'm your host and chair for this evening. As I'm sure you all know, the Royal Society of Edinburgh is Scotland's national academy, established in 1783 for the advancement of learning and useful knowledge. The RSE's mission remains the same now as in 1783 and is woven into all that the RSE does, knowledge made useful. This is the RSE's third annual events programme, Curious. The programme started on Monday of this week and will run until the 27th of August online, with events offering insight from some of the world's leading experts across 4 key themes of health and well-being, innovation and invention, our planet, and COVID-19 living with a pandemic. Details of all the Curious programme events can be found online at www.rse-curious.com. And as with this evening's event, many will be recorded and available to watch in the next few weeks on the RSE's YouTube channel. Before we move on, can I encourage the audience to submit your questions throughout the event tonight using the question and answer function on your screen. Also, if anyone requires subtitles, I believe this can be turned on using the otter.ai function, which can be found at the top of your Zoom screen. As you know, tonight's event is a panel discussion on what we believe is the crucial role of sport, physical activity and cultural participation in not only broadening our understanding of health and well-being, but also potentially providing some of the solutions and a different approach to our country's poor public health. Indeed, the timing of this event could not be more appropriate, with the finale of the Tokyo Olympics and the lifting of pandemic restrictions, allowing increased access to a wide range of cultural and sports venues and events, including the Edinburgh festivals, our numerous countries, museums and theatres, rugby, football and outdoor music events. However, this is not a new topic of debate or discussion, and there is already a wide range of existing research into the role of culture and sport in health and well-being. A few statistics from this research. Pre-COVID, it was estimated that physical inactivity cost the NHS in Scotland around £77 million per year. That equates to over £14 per person. An all-party parliamentary group undertook a major inquiry into the role of arts and health and well-being, with contributions from a number of public health bodies and experts. The associated report, published in 2017, contained strong evidence that creative and cultural activities can have a positive impact on health and well-being, noting in particular that regular physical activity prevents at least 20 health conditions and supports positive mental health. Participation in cultural activities is linked to improvements in well-being, particularly in relation to positive mental health and increased social cohesion. And it found a 20 to 30% reduction in depression in adults participating in daily physical activity, and that physical activity reduces the risk of cognitive decline in adults and older adults, with a 20 to 30% risk reduction in developing dementia for adults participating in daily physical activity. And an important outcome for us now coming out of the pandemic was recognition that social prescribing of cultural and physical activities has the potential to contribute to reducing health service demand, particularly in primary care settings. Professor Chris Whitty said only a few weeks ago, the pandemic has cast a long shadow on mental health and on provision for mental health. The pandemic has led to considerable fear and public anxiety, particularly at the start of the first wave, and the mental health elements of the lockdown and public anxiety were often underplayed. We now know loneliness has become much more common, increasing from 10% of those surveyed in March 2020 to 26% in February 21, and depression levels more than doubled pre-pandemic levels. And of course, we all know that these impacts affect disproportionately groups and individuals already experiencing disadvantage, as well as those employed in sectors hardest hit by lockdowns such as retail, culture, leisure, events and tourism. It's not all totally bad news, as we now have more people cycling and some evidence of increased civic participation, with many new volunteers established across the country. We have improved air quality during lockdown and smokers showing an increased motivation to quit and to stay smoke-free during the pandemic. And this evening, we have an amazing panel of speakers who will I invite in a few moments to introduce themselves to you. They are experts not only in their field, but I know have really interesting views on how post-pandemic, through wider engagement with culture and sport, we can bring a more humane, holistic, people-focused approach to what can feel like overwhelming and intractable health and well-being problems across all our communities, all of which have been magnified and exacerbated by COVID-19 and its social and economic impacts and consequences. So I'll firstly go to Dame Katherine Granger, known to all of us as one of our country's greatest Olympians and current chair of UK sport, but Katherine's also known to me as a lover of museums. So Katherine, can you introduce yourself and say a few words as to why you think the topic tonight is so important?
With pleasure, Bridget. First of all, thank you for having me on the panel, and it's an absolute joy to be here with everyone. Yeah, I mean, I was born and bred in Glasgow, grew up there, moved through to Edinburgh to go to university, and it was at university that I found the sport of rowing, which I did. You know, I went to study law and I thought that would be my future. I found rowing. When I found rowing, I probably found the best group of friends that I ever could imagine. They're still my best friends to this day. I've got four godchildren now through my university time at rowing, and I've had two more since then through my university, all through my rowing friends. And I probably found out more about myself through the next 20 years when I joined the British rowing team, and that became my kind of pathway through life. And it's not a career I thought I'd follow. It's not an area I thought I'd get into. I just thought I'd do sport for fun. And it stayed fun for the 20 years I did it internationally, but it gave me so much more. It taught me so much about myself. It really opened my eyes to the reach and the influence, the impact. And I saw it most around 2012, when obviously the Olympics came to Great Britain. And I suddenly heard from so many people, I still hear genuinely to this day, about how either taking part in sport or returning to sport or watching sport has quite genuinely transformed people's lives. And I think when I started off in sport, I didn't ever appreciate the kind of magic that comes with it, and the influence and the impact and the inspiration that is part and parcel of sport. And I think, you know, it's partly why I wanted to stay in sport. When I left as an athlete, I continued in my role now as chair of UK sport. Although part of me felt I should leave sport for a while, so I wasn't going to be pigeonholed for the rest of my life in sport. But I got an amazing opportunity to apply for, and then was successful in the role of chair of UK sport. And it means I still work in sport every single day. And I've just come back from Tokyo. And I kind of thank my lucky stars every day that I fell into this by accident, and it sort of, I don't know, redirected my whole life in the direction, because I didn't ever appreciate just what a wonderful positive influence sport can be in my life, but in also people's lives that I meet every day. So clearly I'm biased. I'm very, very passionate about it. You know, I guess my sort of raison d'etre every day is to see how much more we can use sport to enhance and help people's lives. And that goes on one end of the scale to our, you know, Olympic and Paralympic athletes we're supporting right now, to, you know, the average person in the street who might never have ambitions on the international stage, but yet if sport can be in their life, I think their life is better for it. So, you know, I'm a very passionate supporter of all things to do with activity and health and well-being and sport. And I've supported it, as I said, at the very top level, but I think increasingly through the pandemic and through the lockdown, I think we've all appreciated just how much it helps in parts of our lives we never thought we'd experience, like just mental well-being and just feeling good about ourselves. So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here to talk about it a bit more, and I'm thrilled to still be in a role that involves sport every day of my life.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here with us, Katherine, and I might get you later on to say something about your love of museums. We'll move on now to Dr. Linda Irvin Fitzpatrick, who is a leader in the strategic planning and delivery of health and social care. Can you too introduce yourself, Linda, and tell us why you believe tonight's discussions are important?
Hi, thank you, Bridget. Yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to be here as a citizen of Edinburgh. I was born here. I've lived here most of my life, apart from 4 years in Holland, and I fell into, I think, public services when I was about 25, and I've worked there for over 25 years. So I'm passionate about what I do. I believe public services should be more open to engaging with the private sector, with the voluntary sector, and of course with our citizens. And I think for me, COVID-19 has really shone a light, as you were saying, Bridget, on inequalities, but it's also shone a light on how kind people can be and how empathetic they can be. And I think we've seen an enormous movement across the city of how we've been able to come together to help one another, to reflect on what's important to us. And I think people have turned to arts, to sports, to exercise, to the environment, because suddenly all these health promotion and health behaviour messages suddenly make sense to people in terms of taking exercise, of being outside, of doing things that make you connect with people. And I think for the first time, people are realising that mental health is as intrinsic to us as physical health. And it's about how we are, how we feel, how we connect with one another. What's important to us all is a sense of self, a sense of belonging, of agency and identity. And we can find that through participating in arts and sports. And I reflect on the title of this series, which is Curious, which of course always reminds me of my favourite book, which is Alice in Wonderland. And a very famous and apt quote, I think, from that is, imagination is the only weapon in the war against reality. And I think COVID, we have to build on the opportunities, and it seems a weird thing to say opportunities and COVID in the same sentence, but we've got an opportunity here to really reset things. And I think thinking about physical and mental health side by side, not separating them out, but thinking holistically and thinking of the passion and the inspiration that our artists inspire in people and our sports people inspire in people, particularly for our young people who've had such an awful 20 months. How can we build upon that across the city and really make and exploit the physical assets of the city, of which we have many, but these assets don't always seem equally available to everybody. Thank you.
Terrific, thanks very much. And last but not least, Mel Young, international social entrepreneur, currently chair of Sportscotland and a founder of the Homeless World Cup. Can you introduce yourself, Mel, and say a few words as to why you're so keen to be part of this discussion?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this panel discussion today. I think it's a very, very important and very relevant, as both Katherine and Linda have explained from their point of view. I'm a social entrepreneur, and one of the things that I helped found was the Homeless World Cup in 2003. And there's clear evidence there. We work in 72 countries across the world that working with the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized, people who have severe issues in terms of their alienation, lack of self-esteem and self-worth, how sport can transform their lives. So working with some of the people in the most difficult circumstances, we have evidence that sport can make a difference. So that's the first point I would want to make. Other social entrepreneurs are joining in this. I think that sport is understated in the power that it has. It's very, very powerful in terms of creating positive change for good. In terms of Sportscotland, I think Sportscotland is in a unique position in Scotland, possibly in the world, because it comes within the health portfolio. I don't think there's any other country in the world where sport sits in there. And there's an absolute logic for that, in my opinion, because it's about physical activity. And sport can play a massive contribution to some of the challenges that we have, particularly in the West at the moment, through lack of physical activity. It's obvious, it's a bit of a no-brainer. So what sport needs to do, and what we try to do in sport in Scotland, is to create one system. And that one system means anybody who's involved in sport at whatever level is involved. So whether you are a high-performing athlete, and we've seen how well Scots have done in Tokyo, right through to somebody who just wants to play in a game in the park, should be included. So sport needs to be inclusive for any sector, for anybody, and we should be making efforts, and we do make efforts to get to the hardest to reach people, the people who find it most difficult. Sport is absolutely brilliant for involving people. You can invent games and invent ways in which people really who have apparently no ability to get to the Olympics, but can actually do park runs, because everybody can do a park run, which, as we know, hopefully is coming back in Scotland this Saturday, and you run or walk 5K, and everybody can be involved in that. So the final thing I would say on this, Bridget, is that actually I think we should be doing a lot more. Actually, we've had evidence for a long time that sport can make a difference, and that physical activity is vital to our mental well-being and our mental health. We should be doing more. One of the challenges we have is I don't believe that we're necessarily connected up, and we need to be. The sport actually, if you look across the Scottish or UK side, gets a tiny proportion of the overall budget. And actually the impacts that it's making are really substantial. And I think in the past, sports sometimes been seen as part of the entertainment industry, something that's peripheral to local authorities or government, or a nice thing to have, when actually sport actually needs to be brought into the centre as something that's essential, that's delivered in communities and neighbourhoods and regions across the whole country. So I think this debate is really interesting. Difficult times, challenges, but actually at the same time, some fantastic opportunities here in Scotland to build on what's already been created.
Thank you very much. But in the meantime, waiting for questions coming in from the audience, can I start with a question for Katherine? And on the back of Team GB's amazing success in Tokyo, can you tell us your views and your experience? I mean, I think your personal experience, people would love to hear more about that, as to how events like the Olympics can inspire the nation, but also, as we saw in Tokyo, provide a platform to raise important issues like mental health, participation, equality, and sustainability. Could you say a bit about that and draw on your own experiences? I say people will love to hear from you about your own personal experience at the Olympics as well.
Sure, thanks, Bridget. It's a nice topic for me to talk about, I'll be honest. So like I said at the beginning, I probably, hand on heart, really underestimated sort of what sport can do for people and can mean to people. And I think I probably came from a place when I started off competing, even internationally, that, some people love sport and some people aren't really bothered by sport. And somehow when the Olympics and the Paralympics comes around, it's the one time I kind of get talked to the most by people who say, quite honestly, do you know what, I hate sport, or I'm not interested in sport, I don't really like sport, but I love the Olympics, or I love the Paralympics. And there's something that really feels quite magical about this sort of full-year event that, multi-sport, that really showcases the kind of the best of our young athletes. And I think partly there's so much sort of platform given to it that there's really some space to tell the stories behind the performance you see. And I think, like anything, the more you know the people involved and see them as people, the more you can relate and the more you can understand. And yet I probably, until 2012, I still felt, but it's still probably for people who, are kind of, I don't know, naturally inspired by sport, or want to do sport, or want to be involved in sport. And then 2012 happened. And I do think there's something incredible about being a host country and how much closer people feel to it, and how much just connected, I suppose, to the sort of incredible things happening, and how proud, this nation felt enormously proud in 2012 of being able to put on such a brilliant, we're still a relatively small country globally, and yet, every country I spoke to through 2012 were saying these are extraordinary games because of the sort of feeling, the sentiment that's sat behind it. There was a real sense that people want these games to be here and people are celebrating it. And everyone felt very welcomed internationally. And that's a really important thing to feel as a country and as a city, that you are welcoming the world. And it's such a privilege to do. And then I think in the aftermath of 2012, it was then I got most, I got letters, I got emails, I bumped into people all the time who were still talking about the summer. And I had met, I'd still get moved. I had one message from a woman who was, lived at home with her elderly mother, and she was a carer, full-time carer for her mum. And her mum had passed away not too long before the games began, a few months before the games started. And this woman who was the full-time carer was clearly, really struggling with the loss of her mum. And she said she hadn't been able to leave the house and she hadn't been able to sort of be with other people. And she was obviously not coping with this incredible grief and sense of loss. And then she said she sat at home and just watching the TV and watched the games. And she said, having watched the games and watching these young people take on these incredible sort of sporting challenges, I thought the very least I could do is leave my home and go down to the local nearby shop. And it was the first time she left the house in months. And it's moments like that you think, when you're training as an athlete, you're wanting to achieve things and do things, you don't ever think you will reach people in that way, or you have the potential to do that. And I think it's one very small, and it's just personal to me, but every athlete would have a similar experience, that for some reason what they did has touched people and touched people's hearts and minds as much as inspired them to go out and do lots of exercise as well, but really changed their lives. And I think after 2012, I really appreciated the scale of positive influence that events like that can happen and can have. And I think we saw it again in this year. Clearly we've had a 5 years gap since 2016 in Rio, and the 5 year gap was the delay because of the pandemic that came in and delayed everything from last year. And there's a big question whether or not the game should obviously happen this year. Is it the right thing to do? Was Japan going to be able to host it? Did they want to host it? There's a lot of question marks and speculation. And I think there's a lot of skepticism about whether this is the right thing to do. Should we gather the population of the world to one central place and risk sort of the health that might come with it because of the pandemic? And extraordinary measures were put in place to make sure it was as safe as it could be, and people were looked after as well as they could. And it certainly had, has sort of not caused any, they could track, there's nothing that caused being the Olympic Village or the Olympic performances that changed the COVID at that point. So that was a really sort of positive success. But I think we saw this incredible appreciation of what was needed after a year and a half of, I think we all felt very detached and living quite separate lives, and I certainly felt quite a reduced life through the pandemic, and in a way not, Linda mentioned, not really connected to other people in the way that we normally are. We're a very social species, and I think everything felt quite detached for a long time. And I think something like the Olympic Games coming back to town, it gave a talking point for everyone. It gave a focus for everyone. People were watching it and cheering and excited. And for a while, we weren't talking about the pandemic. We weren't talking about really hard things that are happening in all our lives. We could almost just for a while, suspend all that reality and just enjoy this wonderful inspiration. And I think the biggest thing that's probably changed since I was an athlete is how that platform is now used much more consciously by athletes. We had Adam Peaty, who did brilliant performances in the swimming pool, but then spoke about how he needed to take time out for his mental well-being. And that's someone who's the top of their game, who's not afraid to say, but I'm struggling, and I do struggle with this, and this is difficult. We had Tom Daly, again, doing great things from the diving platform and talking about how difficult it is to compete in countries where being in any way LGBT isn't welcomed and is illegal. And he can talk about that and embrace that. We had Emily Campbell, who's the first ever female weightlifter we've ever had on a medal podium. And without, any planning, she passionately talked about, how it's difficult being a woman in sport and looking different and not feeling you can get the right outfit to suit you because you don't look like a normal athlete should look. And she's really tackling a lot of sportswear companies to challenge how they design their sportswear and how they should make women feel, whatever size and shape you are, that you are welcome in this area. With Hannah Mills, who was a brilliant sailor, who went out and has done incredible things about sustainability and clearing up beaches and bringing these things to subject matter. So, and I think Simone Biles, who internationally as a gymnast, we all thought we'd be watching Simone Biles potentially deliver 5 gold medals in Tokyo. And what she did instead was probably create the most widest, strongest platform to discuss how you can be seen to be a leader in the world in one area, and yet suddenly switch the focus, that it wasn't about what a good gymnast she was, it was about what a strong individual she was, to say, I cannot do this at these games because I'm not in the right space to be able to tackle the pressure that comes with this. And she had huge followers and huge support always because of the person she is and the athlete she is, but she gained even more respect for being able to say, actually right now I can't compete in the way I want to because I'm not in the right headspace for that. And it just opens the door for people who are also struggling and suffering with all these different areas, or who care passionately about these different areas, to feel, if these people are at the top of their game and they can also share what they're challenging with, then actually suddenly everyone can talk about it a bit more. So I think one of the proudest thing I am is not just the brilliant performances we saw for Team GB, but just what great role models these young athletes are now, in taking on issues and wanting to be more than just a sport. And I think for a while, athletes could be criticised for trying to be more than their sport. It was almost stay where you are, do what you do best, and keep your mouth shut. And now it's actually no, open the mouth and talk about things that matter to society, and you can actually change society for the better from that brilliant platform as an athlete. And that feels the biggest change I've seen even since I've retired, in that athletes are, and it's not for everyone, and not every athlete should feel they have to, but those that are comfortable speaking out on issues, they have a great voice that needs to be heard. And I think it's done a lot of good for society, them speaking out.
Thanks, Katherine. That's really, really interesting, and we'll pick up on a lot of that. And there's some really interesting questions coming in, and I'm going to ask Mel, and it actually relates to some of the questions people are asking. You've already said, Mel, that you have worked with some of the poorest people in the world, many of whom had very low self-esteem. And I actually had the privilege of supporting you in the Homeless World Cup, came to Glasgow and met amazing people, heard amazing stories. Can you say a bit more about that work that you have been doing, engaging not just with the poorest, but often people who are really dispossessed and completely sidelined by their country? It was wonderful indeed to hear, about the stories in Russia where some sort of policies and things were changing in relation to homeless people. I think it's something that people want to hear more about. How do you engage with people who are so far away from, our services and support? And it is about that power of whether it was football in this instance or sport. Can you tell us more about that, Mel?
Sure. Thanks, Bridget. And it was great. You're just bringing back memories of that great event we had in Glasgow, and the way Glaswegians took it to their heart. And it's a fantastic atmosphere, and lots of people in our network still talk about that being so positive. I mean, I think that what we do, the critical things that we do when we're involving people, is understanding, first of all, where they are from, so that means that they are incredibly marginalized and very low self-esteem, so don't have any belief in themselves. And so what we do is psychologically, it's the first step in all the countries we work around the world. It's a psychological thing. It's just to make people feel part of something. A lot of the people are just very lonely, isolated on their own. And so we want to try and create a family, if you like. So if you imagine, a lot of these people are just not connected with their family. So imagine everybody that's listening here, what you weren't connected with your family, how would you be feeling? So we basically try and build up those connections in the first step, make people feel part of something. I think the other thing we do in the psychological thing is we try and move away from the stereotypical view everybody has of the people we're working with. So in a lot of our partners, from the early days, we never refer to them as homeless people, we refer to them as footballers. So now they're footballers. So we're talking about, the good goalkeeping saves, or the great goals, or how bad the referee was, or whatever, and who's going to be in the team and so on. You talk about football matters, and you build you're building from there. And then, of course, as they go through and get to represent their country, you can actually see that from a psychological point of view, the real changes that are taking place. So critically, and I tell this story often, in the early days when we were starting the Homeless World Cup, I was trying to explain it to people. I and others used to talk to homeless people and say, this can change your life. You can end up saying on your CV, you've represented your country at the Homeless World Cup. And then after a while, and it's true now, the homeless people say to us before we even open our mouths, we're going to change our lives as a result of being involved in this. And because you have that belief, so you do. And one of the learnings in that psychological part that we're teaching, or is coming out of that, is just about life. So as we all know, I mean, life is not linear up all the time. We all have bad days, and there's been quite a lot of bad days during this pandemic, but we're resilient in different levels, and we survive. And so why do we survive? Well, because we've got family around us, because we've got friends, because we're connected into our neighborhoods and so on. That support mechanism when things don't go right. And so what we're talking to about our footballers, the homeless people, we say to is, look, the sports people, and you know, I've spoken to Katherine about this before. You know, the top sports people in the world, one of the reasons at the top is because they've learned from when they've had bad days, from when they've lost, and worked out how they can get back again. That's what happens to all of us in life. So the people that are excluded, who psychologically feel that they're just never going to get anywhere, nothing's going to happen, start to understand through sport that this is what the change is taking place. So those are the fundamental basics that are going on within our organization around the world. So I think that that's key to anything that we're doing. It relates to work that's going across the UK with sport. It's about building the clubs that we have at local level, and building community sports, etc., to give this sense of people feeling part of something. I think you mentioned in your introduction, you know, about social prescribing. I'm a great believer in that, because doctors and GPs are in a position where people are coming to them and they can say, hey, look, you know, I think you're feeling lonely, you're a bit disconnected. Do you know there's all these clubs around here that you could join? We really encourage you to join. That'd be good for you. We can make an introduction to somebody if you're feeling a bit unsure about it, and you don't have to be any good at it. Just join in. So creating these ways in which you build communities, and what we need to do is build the capacity in the community and the capacity in the people themselves, and then you start to see answers. And that's what we've seen in a microcosm, and that's the system that we need to be creating. But I think what we've done then with the Homeless World Cup as a result of the stories, and we have thousands of stories of homeless people around the world who've just transformed their lives, you know, got jobs, got into houses, come off drugs, made major changes as a result of that football being the key, the football, them becoming footballers, and they're uplifting and inspiring stories. But we connect them back to the world of football. So professional footballers will come and support, and we saw some of those in Glasgow, and that just adds to the whole thing. People understand it. And in fact, the sports, you know, we look at football, sometimes gets a bad rap, and probably justifiably sometimes, but actually some of the work they're doing through their foundations in the community is actually extensive and very, very impactful. So we need to be talking more about that. And what we've been able to do, though, I think, just to finish off here, is to create some policy changes. You mentioned Russia, and countries starting to go, hey, you know what, actually poverty is expensive, homelessness is expensive to society, costs money. And actually by investing a little into a sports system, you can involve people and create change, hence you're saving a lot of money. So when you talk to governments like that, people like that, they start to listen, quite apart from the human dimension and making it better. So it's all about, I think, just changing the whole culture and approach of what we do. People start to listen, people start to join in. And you know, obviously our event's been hit with the pandemic. We're an international events organization, in a sense. It's the last place you want to be just now. But you know, we've got an event coming up in Edinburgh, where Four Nations Cup with this. I'm currently sitting in Rome, where a movie's being made about the Homeless World Cup, which I think will be released by Netflix next year. So there's a lot of people coming to the table going, hey, this is right. A lot of things going on. We want to join in, want to make things happen. And so if you build this, you can demonstrate clearly the power sport has to create change, then you will create change. And the people themselves, with a renewed capacity and building capacity, can do that. And we in Scotland, we have a lot. I mean, there's a lot of really good community clubs. We forget about them. You know, I know Tinnabrook a little, and they've got Cows of Butte down there with the Shinty Club. They're very proud of it. It's part of the community, part of that DNA. Rugby clubs in the borders, all over the place. You'll find these things that are absolutely essential parts of the community, and we need to preserve them, look after them, and build them.
Thanks for that, Mel. I'll come back to you and Katherine about this wider, more difficult thing about how do we get governments to change that policy that still sees a majority of funding and support going not to local areas but to larger national events, etc. And actually, you know, the argument is that we do need both. We do need, you know, those sort of great achievements that we see athletes having just made in Tokyo, but there is certainly post-pandemic, and a lot of the questions are around this issue, the lack of funding that's now available at a local level. But as I said, I'll come back to you. I was going to ask Linda, as someone who's been involved directly in creating a citywide strategy for mental health and well-being, and you've been trying to connect that strategy with culture and sport. Can you give us a bit of insight and tell us about your approach and some of your successes and challenges?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'd like to highlight, we've got numerous initiatives across the city, and I have to say, the points that Mel was making there about local community foundations for football foundations are active partners in a lot of work that we're doing currently. So with Big Hearts Foundation and Hibernian Community Foundation, and also with the Spartans. A great example, I think, is how we're about to start a programme with one of the football clubs around how we work with young people who may have been written off already at the age of 14 or 13 or even younger, because they don't quite fit into their educational establishment, or they're starting to misbehave, they're unruly, whatever, but they've been written off and they've not been allowed to have aspirations sometimes. But a number of young people are really interested in football, and how can we use that as a hook to then engage them in lifestyle programs and ways to get engaged in football that isn't that everybody's going to be an international football player, but that there's a whole industry around football, whether that's catering, whether that's grounds management, whether that's media, whether it's management, that can create a whole set of career opportunities for young people, and then using members of the club themselves to be coaches and mentors for the young people. So we're really excited about this programme, and we think it's got scalability, and we think it's got scalability not just to other football clubs, but to other sporting clubs and institutions. In terms of the arts, we've been involved with the Mental Health Foundation for the last 16 years in Scottish Mental Health Arts Festival, which is the biggest arts festival of its kind in the world. And indeed, my colleagues in the foundation have spread that model to different parts of the world. And what I've seen through the years that I've been involved in this has been people's sense of identity changing. So often we talk about service users or a person with schizophrenia, or as Mel was saying, a homeless person. Suddenly you bring them into a different place and people can explore these aspects of themselves that maybe they did enjoy art or they did enjoy performing when they were younger, but for whatever reason, it was never seen to be an option or something they could pursue. And you give people these opportunities, and honestly, it's like a huge transformation. Suddenly people describe themselves as being a poet or a writer or an artist, and it is just that sense of self and sense of agency changing. And I think the thing that we need to do more of, and we're doing quite a lot of it in Edinburgh, but we can always do a lot more, is to bring together different thinkers into different spaces so that we come up with different solutions. Because if we just continue to engage in our silos and our health world or our sports world or our arts world, we won't get some of this amazing creativity that we can see. And picking up on Katherine's point about people being role models, and how do we use that for the power of good for some of our people that are most disadvantaged or most unheard.
I've got a question which is a general one for everyone on the panel, and I'm going to try and relate it to some of the questions that have come in particular. We've had some people saying, could we also try and talk not just about sport, but also about the power of public libraries, reading, writing, art, music, and importantly, the loss of some of these services in communities. I guess a lot of the questions are basically saying, we're all bought into this agenda. Everyone knows, you know, the power of culture and sport. I suspect everyone who's on this call, we all know that. What can we do? And, you know, particularly talking to Katherine and Mel, who chair major agencies, what can we do to get the politicians, the decision and policy makers to somehow help shift this huge public sector that does operate still in silos? I mean, and I think someone has also said, interestingly, there's a downside, Mel, of being associated with health. Health budget is ginormous and sport is just a drop in the ocean. And, you know, to get, again, that shift in funding, have you got any advice, any ideas? What would you say to the politicians if they said to you, what do we do here to turn this around so that culture and sport are much more of a central feature of community life and funded as such? Katherine, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I find it immensely frustrating that, and I believe we do still need to do that work, and I feel we still need to win that argument. I find it very frustrating that we still need to do that. I think, you know, in a world that now feels much more aware of the importance of just well-being, and how physical activity needs to be equally matched by, you know, mental well-being as well. And, you know, the impact you see at you know, everything from school level, you know, from kids, and we've seen all the negative impact of lockdown and that lack of connection and community feel. I find it very frustrating that we still need to, it feels like it's still an argument we need to win to persuade people how important sport and culture and all those, the things that sometimes can be seen as extra, you know, nice things to have, but not essential. I find that very frustrating. It feels like they're still seen as nice extra things to have rather than they should be core in everyone's life. You know, how to shift the mood. I mean, you know, my job, my role is very much in the high performance end of sport, and the best thing we have is this moment when we have the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games happening. It does get a huge, very brief, it's a very, very small window we have. It's, you know, 2 weeks for the Olympics, 2 weeks for the Paralympics every 4 years. So it's a very short window, but it's a very powerful window. And with things like, you know, we'll get the politicians, you know, usually to attend the games or to actually experience it firsthand, because I think when you experience it, you don't just see it, you feel it, you feel the impact it can make. And that is a big impression. You know, I'm the daughter of an English teacher, and my mum sort of right from the beginning, I was sort of brought up with theatre in Glasgow in my life as much as we could go. And I before I really got so heavily involved in sport, you know, I was equally passionate about that side of culture, and I think it has a huge impact. And the harder thing I think with culture, I think it's really suffered through the lockdown. We've clearly seen with the, you know, you've seen it with museums, we've seen it with the theatres, everything's sort of shut for a long period of time with a huge uncertainty around it. And I think we still need to build people's confidence in coming back to it. And I think the harder thing with that side of culture is it doesn't have the same sort of one moment as the Olympics has and the Paralympics has to argue its case. So I think we almost need to, you know, Mel would be saying the same, any access we have to our politicians, it's just a constant piece of work to persuade and encourage and get them to experience and explain all over again. And the hardest thing I find with a lot of the politicians is they change so much, is that, you know, it's, you almost feel, here we go again, let's start again. And I have to say, when I have spent time with them and they get to experience it firsthand, they do get it. And they do sort of become, you need them to be advocates for what we all know and believe. But sometimes it can feel hard work, because what the pushback we often get is, you know, yes, we know it's important, but so is everything. You know, everything in government's important. So it's kind of where you can try and get the attention, where you can prioritize. And, you know, Linda just mentioned there, we've got some brilliant role models, certainly from sport, but we've got the same through culture as well. And actually having voices that have, you know, do have, I mean, I always talk about the platforms they can have, but some voices do get listened to more. That's not necessarily right or fair, but it's what happens at the moment, and actually is making sure that the people who are very, you know, strong voices and carry some interest actually get listened to and are used to make sure they can influence as well. So it's about constantly trying to find where the influence can be to keep fighting this argument.
Yeah, I mean, I have to confess I was in a very depressing meeting today with very supportive people. Those of you who know Glasgow, it actually is probably the biggest funder of culture and sport amongst all the local authorities. But even then, that funding, which is huge, is less than 5% of the total council budget. And the conversation today was about the settlement that may be coming next year for local government may mean, because there's prioritisation of social care, understandably, education, understandably, environmental health, understandably, that there might have to be an even bigger cut in our sector. And that's in a city that's generally hugely supportive. And I guess it is, you know, the scale of the task, and maybe we're hoping for too much too soon, although I think if you're not overly ambitious, you know, you don't really get very far. But, you know, it's almost like that shift where for a long time preschool education was just seen as childcare and playtime. And it was, you know, a look at the investments that goes into university education as opposed to nursery education. And certainly governments over about 20 years have tried to change that. Still not there, but they have tried to change that balance. And it seems to me we need to get that change with us too, but we run the risk during the pandemic, I would suggest, of a lot of what we do, especially at a local level, just bluntly going down the tubes. So, Mel, I'm you know, I'm not asking you for, you know, the answer because it's almost impossible, but what would you advise, what would you say to politicians who are also, like us, they're human, they're grappling with these big, imponderable, difficult issues?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult, and they do have some real challenges, to be fair. I think, first of all, you've got to persuade politicians, and it's difficult to think about the long term. The cost in health is going to go up the longer we're physically inactive. So therefore, being active is the thing to do. Sport's got a role to play in it. So if you invest in this area now, get people active, you're going to save money in the long run. But of course, politicians think in the short term. So it's a question of getting that across. I think that's really, really important. That's the first thing I think is needed. Secondly, it's about, and I think you mentioned it earlier, it's about getting out of silos. There's far too much silos going on in Scotland. So that I was involved in people did some presentation to me in Utrecht in Holland from the city of Utrecht a few years ago. And the first slide they started off with was just a picture of an underpass. And they said, we invested, I think it was €500,000 in this underpass. And we were thinking, you know, city, I'm saying, are we talking about roads? I thought we were talking about sport and physical activity in this presentation. He said, this is really, really important, this underpass, because it connects where the sports centres were with where people were and where they were going. And this underpass would get people out of cars, get people onto bikes and get them going to the sports centres, etc. So what the point of this, why I'm using this as an example, was the connectivity across the departments in terms of a bigger vision they had for the city was very, very clear, okay? So let me give you an example of what I think should be happening now. It is to a degree, but it could be fantastic potential. You know that the World Cycling Championships is coming to Glasgow in 2023 and wider Scotland. It's fantastic. The first time ever that all the cycling disciplines are going to be in one country at one time. Just fantastic. But the really thing that could be fantastic about this is the legacy. We could be getting people, but majority people, particularly young people, onto bicycles as a result of that competition, which will be inspiring and it will be huge in the media. But you need everybody on board then. It's not just about the sports department or even Glasgow Council or Glasgow Life. It's about the transport department. It's about the education department. It's about getting everybody around the table to have a common vision and a common strategy about how we deliver the longer term impacts of an event like that. And that's the thing that I think is worrying. I think that we at Sportscotland sometimes get just a bit frustrated with the silo mentality in government. The other thing that I think we really need to start working on, because it's easy in a sense sometimes just to blame, oh, it's the government and it's the politicians and why don't they give us more money? I think we have to change the culture, our own, we individually and as communities, we have to take some action ourselves. And, you know, I would point at the media sometimes. For example, I was watching the BBC Scotland there on the news on Monday, which was literally some type of Freedom Day. And the things that they focused in on were bars that were opening, nightclubs that were opening, and the fact that everybody was going to get absolutely out of their head drinking. And during the pandemic, the BBC has concentrated a lot of times, anytime they wanted to have an example of a sector that was badly hit, it would be a pub. Now, I enjoy having a beer myself, so I'm not trying to be a killjoy. But if all we can say, an American friend of mine said, is your country in the UK a bunch of alcoholics? Because all we talk about is drinking all the time. And so why aren't we talking about the Freedom Day that sports facilities are opening up? Why aren't we talking about a different way in which maybe children could get to school? You know, I'm sure you'll know Tegla LaRoupe, and he does such a great work with kind of peace and sport. She was the world half marathon world record holder, and she used to run to school, 10 kilometers to school, primary school, and back again. You know, I was in Tanzania a few years ago, and all the kids are walking to school, and they have that culture there. We need to start having these priorities in the way we go about our lives. And so, yes, it's about government, and they need to provide a lead, and we all need to provide a lead. And the final thing I would say, because I have an ability to go on and on, is I think that there is sport. We are getting better at this, but we need to be telling the story better. Katherine was talking about it, you know, the athletes and as role models and so on. And to say it's not just all about medals. Medals is part of it. We want Scotland to win the World Cup. We want, you know, that's there. It's a given, okay? But actually, there's so many other things going on. The good that sport is doing, as I mentioned earlier, in communities that's happening. We should be talking about that story and talking that up. And once we get that message across, I think people come to the table much more. So we've got work to do. It's not easy. But I still think that sport gets a really bad rap in terms of the amount of investment it gets, certainly a tiny amount. And you mentioned, you know, the small amount that's coming out of your budget. If you would invest in that, connected with a culture shift, you'll transform the country.
Yeah, some interesting questions about those very subjects. One of the questions has said in some of the countries that have managed to deliver sustained increases in physical activity levels like Finland and Canada, being active and outdoorsy is part of the national identity. This person says, what do you think we can do to shift our collective self-identity of what it means to be Scottish, British, from an often self-deprecating view of ourselves as a country of couch potatoes to a country who takes part in sport and physical activity. So, you know, I think people really see that there needs to be that culture change. And there's another question in here about the media and their focus not on the good things, not on the grassroots sport, the impacts it's making. And I guess, you know, Linda, from your experience, is there any advice that you could give as to how we can all try and keep helping change the approach to this, get the media to look more at what's happening that's really good at a local level, and, you know, thereby change, hopefully, policy making at some stage?
It amazes me because the policy landscape in Scotland is so rich, and we have a national cultural strategy, we have national sports strategies. What we don't do is link them up enough. And I think we've got, I know in Edinburgh, we're having a session in September where we're inviting, the Lord Provost and I are inviting local MSPs and the MPs to come and hear what we're doing across the city in terms of mental health and wellbeing. So it will cover arts, it will cover sports, it will cover social prescribing, it will cover our use of our green spaces. all of these things, because often when people talk about mental health, they go straight to services and straight to treatment services. And that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about mental health and wellbeing. So I think there's an onus upon all of us to take personal responsibility for what we can do within our sphere of influence and maximise it and really max it out. And I think we can talk a lot about funding, but equally we could also talk about all the money that is spent that is maybe just not directed or connected enough. And I think we really have to get to these spaces. And I often talk about that intersection where the magic happens, where you bring together Katherine, Mel, myself, whoever else into a different space and have a different conversation and what different solutions we would come up with. So I would really, if you think about the mile a day that the doctor introduced for school children, it's incredibly simple. So why don't we do that for adults in a more ambitious way? So I absolutely believe that we are at a point now where if we don't do it now, when will we do it? And wouldn't it be brilliant, my last comment, to have the news headline saying, brilliant, the libraries are open again?
Yeah.
These bits of our community that are so, so important to us all. And I bet you everybody's been watching Netflix for the last 18 months or whatever other streaming service. What about all the writers, all the artists who are behind all that amazing work that we just consume day on day? Why are we not recognising that more and really celebrating the artistic contribution that we have in Scotland that isn't just about our festivals that happen, it's from our arts down at a grassroots level, and we need to build that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Katherine, do you want to add anything to that? Because I'm conscious that, as I had predicted, we are running out of time.
No, just, I think like Linda said, it really helps getting people who work in these areas, who care about these areas, who are passionate and are probably I think a sense of frustration is usually quite healthy. I think we can't ever get to a place where we think it's too difficult or too hard or we've lost an argument. I think you do need people to get fired up and get frustrated and to feel things aren't good enough. And I think, in my experience, when you get the right people in the room, and like from different areas and different experiences, but who all have that kind of fire within them, then you can make great things happen. So whether it's just we need more, people with different, like we've said, sport and culture is put together. And sometimes you wonder kind of, how much connection is there? But actually there's a lot of overlap. And because these are things that really should be so valued in people's life and often get sort of put in a bit of a box on their own. Like you either like culture or you don't, or you either like sport or you don't. And I think people who are in it feel, no, there's something for everyone in this if people know enough about it, and it's really good for people's lives. So I think so my thing is we should just, the more we can get those voices together and kind of get them louder and listened to, I think we could make some good change.
Absolutely. And I do think, an event like this, an hour, it's only an hour, it's a small event, but it is part of getting the debate out there, changing the public agenda. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago that we would have been now closing some of our roads for bicycle lanes, etc.? People would have thought you were mad. And I guess, it's keeping hope and, recognising that change can come, and it is those small steps. So there are lots of questions still coming in, and I'm sorry for those we've not been able to cover. And not surprisingly, as I anticipated, we've run out of time, and it is clear from the questions still coming in and the answers, we could have this discussion for hours, if not days. However, the debate must continue for all of us, and I know you, our audiences, as I can see from your questions, and our panellists, Mel, Katherine, Linda and myself, will continue in our respective roles to make the case, which I think is increasingly self-evident and in fact a no-brainer, for the inclusion of culture and sport in future public health and well-being strategies, and in particular helping really address, we're not this solution, but we're part of the solution, helping address with other services the huge damage and distress that has been created across the country by the pandemic. As I said earlier, this event is being recorded and will be on RSE YouTube channel shortly. Can I remind everyone that there are further events as part of Curious every day until the 27th of August, and these are still available to book online. Also, everyone in the audience will receive an email asking for your feedback, and we very much hope that you will take the time to give it. And finally, can I say an enormous thank you to Katherine, Linda and Mel for their time and insights this evening. And also a thanks to Hannah Bentley and her colleagues at RSE for organising the event. And of course, a huge thank you to you, the audience, for your participation and your really, really interesting questions. And in fact, your questions give me hope that the agenda will not be lost, that it will only go forward and make an impact. So with that, many thanks again to all of you and a good evening as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers. Cheers. Cheers.
Thank you.